We're going to spend most of this lesson taking a look at what was happening on what's known as the home front, meaning inside the United States, the preparations that were going on for the war effort to support the troops. However, right at the beginning of the lesson, we're going to take a quick look at battle conditions. So as we see here, both sides were using what was known as trench warfare, where they would dig a series of trenches to fortify their positions, make it easier to fight. Unfortunately, since both sides were using the same technology, which include the trenches, machine guns, tanks, and some airplanes, mostly for observation, neither side was able to gain an advantage. You can see, let me see if I can make this a little bit larger here. You can see this particular photo shows from the air an aerial view of the network of trenches that was used. The no man's land would be the area that I'm going through here, and occasionally soldiers would be ordered to go over the top of the front trench and under oncoming gunfire go across to the enemy trenches and attack them in the trenches. Also take note, the top left, you'll see the soldiers are wearing gas masks, and that's because the Germans used poison gas in this war. Mustard gas, which was very deadly even if it got on your skin. So they had suits that they could put on in addition to the masks that you see there at the top. Unfortunately, the effect of this 3-year-long stalemate was simply a rapid pileup of dead soldiers that literally amounted to millions of soldiers. So let's turn our attention to the home front, away from the actual frontline fighting, and see what the United States was doing. We take a look here and we see we've got Uncle Sam urging Americans to register for the draft. This was the first time that the United States had a draft since the Civil War. You can see it was called the Selective Service Act, and all men ages 21 to 30 had to serve if called. There were approximately 2.8 million draftees. Several government agencies are going to be created during the war to coordinate the war effort. Here we see the War Industries Board, which regulated production, determined what was made, where it went, and it established price controls, what the factories could charge for the goods, the war goods that they were producing. Notice in the bottom photos you have women doing the factory production of the war materials. This was because of the millions that went off to fight, the men that went off to fight. Women were asked to step up and do their share to come in and work in the factories, and they did. It was after the war that they were going to turn around and say, because of their service both in the military and at home in the factories, they demanded the right to vote, which they received in 1920. Food was an issue during the war, and this is one of the few times we can talk about farmers actually doing well. Food prices rose during the war because there was demand for food, not just from the American public, and not just to feed the soldiers overseas, but to feed the French largely as well, since most of the battles on the Western Front were occurring in France and Belgium. Those folks, the farmers in those countries, were not growing food, they were fighting, so the people there needed to be fed as well. As a result, Americans were asked to conserve food. Here's an example of conserving wheat. You can see there was a large propaganda campaign to encourage this behavior. All right, meatless Tuesdays, porkless Thursdays and Saturdays. The Committee on Public Information put out a number of posters and whatnot to encourage behavior rather than legislate behavior. Herbert Hoover ran the Food Administration and was a fan of exactly that approach. Something else that the government needed us to do and encouraged us to do was to buy bonds. This was because the government needed money, needed it quickly to pay the soldiers, to pay the factories. Fighting a war is expensive, and the only way the government gets money is through taxes or by borrowing it. In this case, it chose to borrow it and ran the Liberty Bond campaign. Liberty bonds put individuals in the role of the banker. When you buy a bond, you're actually loaning the government money. The government promises to pay you back at a later date and time with interest. Interest being the cost to borrow the money. But for you, it's additional money that you're getting. So Americans looked at this as an investment. All right, and you can see the campaign that was put out by the government to get Americans to buy Liberty bonds. And the government raised about $20 billion through this effort. Another example of getting Americans to purchase less food was to grow victory gardens. And again, you can see the posters that indicate the propaganda campaign to encourage folks to plant wherever they could, because every bit that they grew was that much less that they had to buy. Again, allowing for the government to buy direct from the farmers and ship it overseas. The single largest movement of African Americans out of the South occurred with the start of the war. This was largely due to taking jobs in the factories, same as the women did. And these factories were located in the northern cities. The map here indicates African American movement north and actually west into California. While we're on the subject of African Americans, I should mention that 400,000 African Americans served as soldiers in World War I. They did serve in segregated units. The Army would not become integrated until after World War II. There were critics of the war, and Charles Schenck was one of them. His situation is going to turn into a very significant Supreme Court case in 1919 called Schenck versus United States. Essentially, Charles Schenck was passing out flyers encouraging those that had been drafted not to show up, essentially to dodge the draft and ignore their orders to report for duty. Schenck was arrested for doing this under the Espionage Act. The Espionage Act was created 2 months after we went to war, and it was enforced by Mitchell Palmer, the United States Attorney General under President Wilson. The Espionage Act essentially made it a crime for any person to convey information intended to interfere with the U.S. Armed Forces prosecution of the war effort or to promote the success of the country's enemies. Anyone found guilty of such acts would be subject to a fine of $10,000 and a prison sentence of 20 years. This is what Charles Schenck was found guilty of violating. At issue for the justices to decide was whether or not the Espionage Act violated Schenck's free speech rights. And the main point in their opinion, in a unanimous 9-0 opinion, they found in favor of the government. The essence here is this sentence that I'm circling now. The question in every case is whether the words are used in such circumstances and are of such a nature as to prevent a clear and present danger that they will bring about substantive evils that Congress has a right to prevent. In other words, the justices created a test called the clear and present danger test in their decision. Speech is not protected under the First Amendment if what is being said presents a clear and present danger. The analogy they use in the opinion is that one cannot yell fire in a crowded theater when there's no fire. You're going to cause a panic and people are going to get hurt. Therefore, that's not protected speech. All right, they're arguing that what Schenck was doing in passing out these flyers and urging people to ignore their draft orders put the nation in danger, because if many folks did follow what Schenck was suggesting they do, we wouldn't be able to fight the war, put ourselves in danger. So he lost. But the importance for us is the creation, from this case, the creation of the clear and present. To sum up then, we had a draft and 2.8 million men were drafted to fight in the war. Women and African Americans took the jobs of men that went off to fight. Both also served in the military. The government controlled factory production and encouraged Americans to help in the war effort, growing victory gardens, conserving certain foods, buying Liberty bonds to raise money for the war effort. And the Schenck versus United States decision created the clear and present danger test for free speech. The next lesson, we're going to take a look at the peace treaty and its effects.